Hey there, Marie Greene from Olive Knits here, and this week I want to share a helpful knitting tip. Knitters often ask me, how do you know when it's time to move to a longer circular needle when you're knitting on a sweater, especially a top-down sweater where it starts to grow and grow with increases as you get closer and closer to the sleeve divide? There are two things that I keep in mind when I'm deciding about moving to a longer needle. First things first, when you're ordering your needles or when you're looking through your needle selection and trying to decide which ones you're going to need, you're never going to need a needle longer than the circumference of the bust of the sweater. So if you're knitting a sweater that is 48 inches in circumference, you're not going to need a 60-inch length circular needle because that is going to be longer than necessary for the number of stitches you have. Now, if you knit a lot of top-down seamless sweaters, then you know there comes a point where you have all of the body stitches and all of the sleeve stitches on the needle at the same time. But that's such a small period of time during your knitting, and even though it might feel a little bit more crowded during that time, it's really not necessary to go to the longest possible needle to accommodate those, because as soon as you separate the sleeves away and then you're just working on the lower body, you don't want a circular needle that is longer than the circumference of the stitches that you are going to have on your needle. Because if you've ever knit a hat and you started decreasing the top and you didn't move down to double points, or you didn't know to move down to a smaller needle, so you're trying to stretch all those stitches around a needle that's just too long for the area that you are trying to work around, that's what happens if your needle is too long for the job. So definitely better to err on the side of a little bit shorter. So my rule of thumb is I will always make sure that my circular needle length is smaller than the full circumference of the project that I'm working on. So if I am knitting a sweater that has a 40-inch circumference bust, I'm not going to go above a 32-inch circular needle length because that will give me plenty. Now, on your way to that point, you might start with a 16-inch circular and you're working in the neckline, and then it starts to get a little bit crowded, so you might go up to a 24-inch. And you might be thinking, when is the time? Like, how do I know when it's the right time to do that? When your stitches start to get really crowded on the needles and you feel like you don't have the ability to move them freely, and you're just kind of moving these clusters of stitches and they're getting really stuck together and they feel really crowded, that's usually a sign that it's time to go to the next length circular needle. Most of the time you only have to go up one length. So if you're on it, like I'm on a 24-inch right now, I'm going to go up to a 32-inch, and then I'll be good to go for the rest of the sweater because this circumference isn't going to get much bigger than 40. So that'll be plenty for what I need. But one of the problems is you can technically knit crowded stitches on a smaller needle, especially if that's all you have. Been there, done that. We've all done it. But one thing that happens is if you are working on a needle and your stitches are really crowded, sometimes it's easier to miss mistakes because everything is smushed together so tightly. You may miss a dropped stitch. You may not see an area of the stitch pattern that went wonky. Maybe a cable that got goofy, maybe a little bit of the lace isn't quite right, because when it's smushed together, you don't have as much visibility over the landscape of your stitches. So it really does work a little better if they have a little bit more room to move freely without being too stretched, but enough room that you can move them around easily on the needle and you can make sure that you are staying on track with the pattern that you're working on. So those are my quick tips for knowing which circular needle length that you need, and I'll be back with more of those helpful tips for knitters soon.